The untold story of a century-long struggle hidden beneath layers of history, where land and wealth slipped through the fingers of African-American families. What were the shocking tactics used? Approaches that were as subtle as they were lethal, leaving echoes that still resonate today. Join us as we look into a web of how whites brutally robbed blacks from their land and wealth. In the early 1900s, African Americans held ownership of about 14 million acres of land. By the turn of the 21st century, they had lost possession of 90% of the land. At the present time, African Americans only own a total of 1.1 million acres of farmland, of which 1.7 million acres are held in joint ownership. Over the course of a century, white farmers and landowners devised a variety of strategies to steal the land of African Americans. These strategies included tax sales, heirs property, and the Torrens Acts. One must analyze the severe means that were employed by those who captured the land from African American homeowners in order to gain an understanding of the extent of the land that was taken. Both the rules and the practices made it possible for white landowners, farmers, and developers to game the system in order to gain control over land that was owned by African American farmers and homeowners. Different states had different policies on the methods by which people were permitted to steal land, and each state had its own strategy to trick black people out of their land. The inheritance of property, on the other hand, was a strategy that was utilized by all of them. In the vast majority of instances, black people did not have wills, which is a legal document that may be used to pass land from one person to another after the death of the owner. When there was no will, the land was divided fairly among all of the known descendants of the deceased person. As those descendants began to die off, the land would continue to be parceled out among the descendants of their descendants. There is more to these unspoken strands that have shaped generations, so stay tuned to the end as we reveal how history continues to shape our reality. Over the course of several generations, the number of owners would increase to a significant level. According to Modern Farmer, this presented difficulties for the landowners because it is difficult to use heirs' property as collateral on a mortgage, to subdivide it or to develop it, or any number of other things of a legally binding nature, without first identifying and tracking down every heir and gaining consent from each individual. It was finally made simple enough for other individuals to come in and take possession of the land, especially considering that every member of the family could not be located to request permission for selling the land. Therefore, even if certain members of the family desired to maintain ownership of the land, other family members could decide to sell it. The land would ultimately be owned by white developers who would take advantage of the miscommunication among the family and seize possession of the property. The second scam that was utilized to cheat black people out of their land was the sale of their property through taxation. Tax sales were a means by which land might be repossessed from its owners and then sold at public auction. In these situations, people of African descent would like to keep living on their land rather than selling it, but the majority of them lived on a set income. As a direct consequence of this, a significant number of these homeowners ultimately discovered that they were unable to pay their annual property taxes. After they fell into debt, the county would put the property up for auction and try to recover its losses. When real estate developers wanted to get their hands on land that families didn't want to sell, they used this as an advantage to their benefit. The Torrens Acts were a third option that was available. The Torrens Acts were modeled after the Torrens systems, which were initially implemented in Australia in the year 1858. It was designed by Sir Robert Torrens with the objective of enhancing the certainty of title to land and to simplify dealings involving land. When it was first passed into law in the United States, the Torrens Act was intended to streamline the process of registering titles. Instead, it turned into a loophole that third parties might use to forcibly evict families from their land through the use of partition sales. A partition sale is when one of a property's owners wants to sell, but the other owners do not want to sell at the same time. The Torrens Act and the restrictions that went along with it made it possible for sales to go through without notifying other family members or other people who shared ownership of the land. Once the sale was finalized, the regulations associated with the Torrens Act protected the buyer from any legal retribution that could be taken by the owners of the property who were not aware of the sale, nor did they agree to it. The cumulative effect of these tactics, which were utilized over the course of a century to either steal land from people or else deceive them into selling it, was disastrous. Between 1950 and 1964, a total of 800,000 acres of land was taken without permission in the state of Mississippi alone. According to the findings of a research group, the worth of the land that was illegally taken in Mississippi ranged from $3 7 cents billion dollars to $6.06 billion in current currency. And these figures are just for one state's worth of riches that white people stole from African Americans by stealing their land. Today in the United States, 43.4% of people who identify as black are homeowners, which compares to 72.1% of people who identify as white, 51.1% of people who identify as Latinx, and 53% of those who identify as Asian, Indigenous, or other. Homeownership is the single most important factor in both the building up of wealth and the transmission of wealth from one generation to the next. The lessons of history teach us that black people's attempts to become homeowners have been met with resistance at every stage. Although redlining is the aspect of the narrative that is likely to be more familiar to readers, the other misleading practices that we have discussed in this article, such as the Torrens Act, heirs property sales, and partition sales, were just as successful. Black land theft is not a topic that is heavily discussed. However, like redlining, it enables people to see that the reason African Americans are behind financially is not because they do not try. Rather, it is because every time they had a chance to get ahead, laws, rules, and regulations, as well as those in power, used the system to bend the rules to take from them. When it came to the stealing of black land, it wasn't just government institutions at fault. It was also white people who had the money and knew the laws that they could employ to take advantage of black landowners. White people were able to exploit government rules and institutions to not only take land, but also profit themselves once they had obtained ownership of it, thanks to the rules and laws that were in existence at the time. It was simple for the rest of us to turn a blind eye to this vast theft because it was carried out over a period of decades and consisted of thousands of seemingly insignificant transactions. Theft of black-owned land in the modern day is not as common or overt as it formerly was, and new methods of wealth extraction have gained prominence. But the story of black land theft in the 20th century shows us that if no one asks what thousands of small financial transactions add up to in a country that was built on slavery, we are setting ourselves up, whether on purpose or not, to miss the next wealth extraction schemes for decades as well. We cannot afford not to address these issues in a society where the typical white family still has 8 times the wealth of the typical black family, and where the racial wealth inequality is getting worse. Theft of black-owned land occurred in the 20th century and continued into the 21st century, and it had significant repercussions for the lives of African American landowners and the people descended from them. According to Stephanie Higgins, whose family had 35 acres of land taken from them in Matthews, North Carolina in 1942, when they steal your land, they steal your future. There is no way for us to know what life would be like. Now, if all of that land hadn't been seized, but the financial destinies of African Americans may have looked very different. As we move through history, it's important to remember the past if we want to make a more fair future. Don't miss the next video, subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and press the bell icon for more updates.